This presentation has been years in the making. 6 years for me and many more for the others. In the summer of 2020, Barbara Hunter, who's also here tonight with the Historical Society, invited me to a meeting to discuss the future of Navvy Jack House. I think primarily I was invited because I was involved with the West Vancouver Foundation at that time, and it seemed pretty clear that a fundraising campaign was going to be needed to save the house. Unlike others who were there, I had little knowledge of the issues and challenges that were confronting the heritage community in West Vancouver. But that afternoon, I met a group of people whose passion for the preservation of our community's history can only be described as inspiring. They had recently been advised by district staff that Navvy Jack House was to be demolished, and they were determined to find a way to save it. I knew little of the house, although I'm old enough to remember the many beachfront cottages that dotted our shoreline for many years. Indeed, our family doctor, if you can believe this, practiced his medicine out of an ancient cottage right next to the Silk Purse. Those were the days. Well, those homes are all gone today, and our beautiful waterfront is now open for everyone. But Navvy Jack House stood alone, rather neglected, and I suspect in the opinion of many, and you can see the photograph, many thought ready for demolition. Well, that afternoon we formed the Navvy Jack House Citizens Group, and the campaign to advocate for the restoration and the repurposing of this historic house was underway. This part of the story, in my mind at least, shows a community really at its best. And it begins with a municipal council of the day who was willing to take a second look at their decision, to listen to the many members of the community who fear the loss of a home that was at the heart of our community's history. So in early 2021, we were delighted to learn that the council of the day had reversed its decision to tear down the building. Instead, they had directed staff to identify opportunities for this property that might do one of two things. First of all, provide a significant community benefit, while at the same time minimizing the financial risk to the municipality, because we'd call that good governance. So with a pledge of $1 million from the district, fundraising began for what we called Coffee Cottage. And you can see this rendering that one of our members has done, a charming sketch of what we imagined this house might look like when it was renovated. Our vision for a restored and repurposed charming cottage, much like this rendering from one of our members, was a waterfront destination that would serve as a gathering place for residents isolated at that time by 2 years of a pandemic. As John Mawson, our leader in the group, likes to say, come for coffee, stay for the history. So as you can imagine, despite the generosity of many of our citizens, and some of you are here today and we're very grateful for your contribution and your donation, fundraising millions of dollars required to repurpose and restore this house in the middle of COVID was going to be a significant challenge. Fortunately, we were introduced to Nevin Sanga, a resident in the community with experience in restoring heritage buildings. He had as well a genuine interest in creating something special for his community. In 2023, our current council was successful in negotiating a lease with Nevin's company, Carrera Management Corporation, and the restoration of this sensitive and complex site was underway. When completed, we believe that the house will serve as a symbol of the unique shared history of the earliest settlers and the Indigenous people. Home to Navvy Jack Thomas, a Welsh settler, and Slawiya, the granddaughter of Chief Ki-ep-i-lano, as well as their 4 children, this house had truly a bicultural beginning. To honor that, we were privileged to witness a private blessing ceremony that was conducted in the house during the very early days of the restoration. Andrea Jacobs and others in the room helped us to understand the importance of this ceremony, a traditional cultural practice designed to bring positive energy to important events such as the beginning of a restoration of this home, and to emphasize a connection between the land, ancestors, and the spiritual realm. The story of Navvy Jack House, in my view, is extensive and engaging. And over the next 40 minutes, we will share with you some of the highlights and hope that you will see why this heritage community thought this sad and forlorn home at the time was worth saving as a touchstone for future generations. Well, Paul Hundle knows the story better than anyone. Paul has done extensive research into the history of the property and the people who live there, and I would describe it as frankly scholarly. So he looks forward to telling you of the Thomas and Lawson families and of the early beginnings of what we now call West Vancouver. So please join me in welcoming Paul Hundle.
Thank you, everyone. It has been a labor of love, and I better get going because I'm on a time crunch. Now, the story starts back in 1858 with the gold rush up the Fraser River. This is the masthead for the Harper's Weekly, a journal of civilization in New York, which announced another El Dorado, namely the gold rush up the Fraser in July of 1858. This is where the settlers first arrived in large numbers, and one of those settlers was Navvy Jack Thomas. Now, there's no known photos of Navvy Jack, so we have to just rely on this artistic depiction of what he might have looked like. And his name, Navvy Jack, is linked to a person who's is an endurance digger, a person who would dig canals, dig railway beds, and it was linked in early England to navigators. So navvy is a short form for navigator, but it was particularly for people who did the hard back work of digging out the canals to direct water or to grade a roadbed. So somewhere between 1858, when he went up the Fraser towards Barkerville eventually, and coming back to the North Shore, he earned the name Navvy Jack. His full name is John Thomas, but he became known as John Navvy Jack Thomas. Now, when he first returned, he was part of an exodus from Barkerville. Barkerville was going through a bit of a depression by 1866, and a large number of people left, and he was one of them, and he settled on Burrard Inlet. And he had this open slough, which he used to transport people. His route was at the end of the road from New Westminster. It would end at Brighton, where essentially the Second Narrows, so right where the Brighton Beach is. So people would go from a hotel there and go over to Moodyville, and then from there they would go over to Granville. So he had that triangle he serviced, but it was on demand. But that's how he started, was running the first ferry service across Burrard Inlet to take people to Moodyville and over to Granville and back to Brighton if they wanted to go back to New Westminster. Shortly after, he ended up selling Navvy Jack gravel. That gravel was dug from near the duck pond. Essentially, the duck pond is where he dug out the gravel. We call it the duck pond down just to geographically identify it. But he took that gravel, he took it over to the South Shore, when what was in the village then called Granville, which was to become Vancouver. And much of the foundation of that young town was built on Navvy Jack gravel. And to this day, this is a slide that was taken recently. You can see it's still called Navvy Jack gravel on the top. So it endures to today. Now, he also then went on to build the Granville Hotel right here. This is a close-up shot. And he operated between 1871 and 1873 with Joe Mannion. And it was built with, he built it with Ebenezer Brown, who was one of the first councillors in BC. And so that indicates to me that he could build, because we know that he was part of the building. And that becomes relevant when we try to figure out who built the Navvy Jack House, because we're not positive. We never will be. But the person who actually claimed the land was in 1872 was James Blake, and he was a stevedore. And as you know, stevedores ran crews. They managed longshoremen. So this ad was for his business. If people, a shipmaster wanted to unload some cargo, they would phone up someone like James Blake, who would organize a cruise. I don't believe he was a builder himself. I don't think he would, because he was in a prominent position in business, he likely contracted someone else. And that's why I think it was probably Navvy Jack. Now that's in 1873, James Blake swore this an affidavit that attested to the fact that the Navvy Jack House was built. So we know that in March of 1873, he declared that he'd made improvements to the property, which gives him the right to then sell it on, transfer it. Before that, you couldn't. You could only occupy it and try to improve it. But once you got that certificate improvement, you could do more. You could sell it. And that certificate improvement is proof that the house was built by March of 1873, the Navvy Jack House. So in 1873, now, again, this is what the slide changes. This is, Jeff, I'm going to blame you for this. This is not my slide. I don't know if he was living in the house in 1873. But I do know that the interest was transferred to him the next year, November 1874. But it's possible that he lived there before. Because back in those days, when a person wanted to buy a house, they would pay for it over time, and only when it was fully paid off that it would be transferred to them. So it would stay with the original owner until all the money came in, so they might live there for a few years. And then when the money's paid, then they transferred. So we know that it was transferred to John Thomas in November of 74. Now we also know that he got married to Slawiya, the granddaughter of Chief Ki-ep-i-lano, under the Squamish custom in circa 1875. And she was 22 years old. And so they then had 3 children. Now I showed this slide because this slide is 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. Now this slide is the only record we have on Slawiya. I've been looking everywhere for some. But you can see her name, Slawiya, there. Now, later on, in 1931, Major Matthews, a famous archivist and historian for Vancouver history, did an interview with the cousin of Slawiya's daughter, and she called her Rowiya. So for a long time, and you'll see in many writings, her name is Rowiya. And that name was adopted because from 1931, that's what she's been called. But then this original document shows Slawiya, and I've talked to the family, and they believe it's Slawiya. And I know Andrea Jacobs, who's not here tonight, she believes it's Slawiya. So we are going with Slawiya. But when she died, just before she died, she was baptized Magdalene. Now these are the daughters. And so you see Emma, Mary, and Christine. And I'm pleased to see Kathy Carpenter, who's the great-granddaughter of Christine. We'll show it over there. And Andrea Jacobs is a granddaughter of Emma, great-granddaughter of Slawiya. Anyway, the beauty of this relationship is that they didn't, Navvy Jack didn't force them to give up their culture. It was a merging of cultures, their sharing of cultures, because the daughters continued to live under Squamish custom, married Squamish men. Emma Thomas married Pierre Dominic on July 1st, 1984, and they established their family in Squamish Nation Reserve. Yeah. And then Christine married 6 months later to Henry Jack on January 2nd, 1895, and again they ended up on the Squamish Reserve and raised their family, and the descendants have lived in the Squamish Nation since. And the son, Samson, which we don't have a photo of, he first married Louise, and that was in 1900. And he lived in Musqueam territory. He married a Musqueam girl. She later died, and then he married Susie from the Tsleil-Waututh and settled for many years in the Tsleil-Waututh Nation around Dollarton, and raised his kids there. And then in let's see if my photo's still here. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. I guess it isn't. Anyway, I was going to say that Mary married in 1902, and later there's probably a photo, or not, depending on what you did with my photos. But she married. She was the last to marry, and she too stayed within the nation. Now, this is the rooster story, and this happened in 1888. What had happened was, one has to appreciate that at that time, there was the Navvy Jack ranch, the house and the family. And then beyond that, you'd have to go all the way to the lighthouse, which was for other colonial settlers. It was basically Navvy Jack and the lighthouse, nothing in between in those early years before 1890. And so in 1888, there was a steamer coming back from Vancouver Island, loaded with passengers, and they were on their way to Granville. So they needed to get under the first narrows, through the first narrows, which was a challenging, difficult task. And there was heavy fog before the narrows. And the steamer had to come to a halt and was completely locked in and didn't know what to do. And then the captain heard the rooster that he knew was Navvy Jack's rooster. And so he figured out the bearings from where the rooster was calling from, and he knew exactly where to go to get through the narrows, and he got the passengers to Granville. Yeah, so that's the rooster story. Now, the first Crown Grant was issued in 1890, 2 years later. There was a delay in the issuance of Crown Grants because there was a freeze on the issuance of Crown Grants when the CPR was being planned, and to bring it here. And even though it was already here by then, he never got his land granted to him formally until 1890. So at that point, he had the right to sell parts of it, to subdivide it. And so he came up with this plan. And you can see that there's 84 lots here, and Navvy Jack's house. They actually show the house here and other accessory buildings. You can see John Thomas's name there, signing it. But that became, and one thing I thought was kind of cool, and Phil Chapman in the back would appreciate, it's in chains. It's not in feet or meters. It's measured in chains, and I've seen old plans. That was the first time I saw it mapped in chains. But anyway, he started to try to sell. But what also happened in 1892 is there was a depression here, and he couldn't sell. Throughout the 1890s, that wasn't when you sold land, that's when you bought it. It made people rich because they could buy land at that time for so cheap. Poor Navvy Jack had no chance of getting a decent dollar for his land. He did sell this section to a friend who was William Maurice Jones. And it was about, I roughly estimate, at 12 acres. This whole lot here is 60. The original Crown Grant was 160, but 100 acres was sold to E. Mahon, a British financier, the brother of a British financier, John Mahon. And so that was never his anymore. I think he probably had to borrow or sell to get the money to do the survey and to just continue to finance himself to live on. So after that, he was left with 60, and then he sold off about 12, and that was 2 years later. But something else also happened, and again, in 1893, he was defrauded out of his lot. Somebody falsely transferred all his property, all the property remaining, into their name. Mr. J. Gill was arrested this morning on a warrant from Victoria based on the information made by one John Thomas, who alleges Gill conveyed to his wife, Minnie Gill, certain property in North Vancouver which he knew or he had no right to convey. So it was all transferred into his name. He then had to go into court. He won the court action, but you can imagine how expensive it is for lawyers back in 1894. And then when even though he won the case, they found that the property had to be transferred back into his name. By then, there was a couple of mortgages on it. And the mortgages were bona fide purchasers for value, as the judges would call them under law. They were innocent. So the mortgages were valid. So even though this person stole the land, put in his name, the banks who lent the money were innocent, and so the mortgage stayed, he had to pay it off. Navvy Jack got the property back with the mortgages and had to pay it off. Anyway, he then went in 1894, mortgaged the property to a Mary Greek, who was a California-based private financier. She lent him the money, and then Navvy Jack, not long after, went up to Barkerville. Now, you remember when I was talking about the daughters, that Emma got married in July of 1894, Christine got married in January of 1895. So around that time, his two oldest daughters were married, and he was off. Now, what have you? Oh, I think what this is an ad showing that it was an announcement in the paper saying that Navvy Jack was back in town. And this was in July of 1895. So we know by that, he had to have been up in Barkerville, because there's something in the social column in the newspapers, they're saying Navvy Jack is back in town. So between 1894, his daughter's marriage, and July 1895, he'd gone up to Barkerville, and he had obtained the Jack of Clubs claim on Jack of Clubs Creek. The death certificate, he died up in Barkerville, November 14th, 1897. And by that time, he had first hired a governess to take care of the two youngest children. As I said, the two older daughters, Emma and Christine, got married. The younger ones, Samson and Mary, ended up being taken care of at first by the governess, and then they ended up at the Kolkwilitsa residential school in Chilliwack. So they were there for a while, and the house at this point was abandoned. And the house remained abandoned for another, till 1905. So another 8 years. Now this is one slide which shows, I was talking earlier about it, and you can see this was from a census that was taken in 1913, and you can see Samson Thomas was 31 by that time, his wife Susie 20, and then these were the children down to Hilda, 2 months old. He had a couple more after that. But he was living on the Broad Reserve at that time. And in fact, part of his land was taken for the Dollarton Highway. And he made a complaint to the Indian Commission about that. I found some records about that. Anyway, this is the photo I was looking to marry when she was married, John Finley, in 1902. And so what happened to the house? Again, when he died, the administrator of his estate was appointed by the government, and it was up in Quesnel, and the only posting of any probate documents, and this is one of those postings which I obtained from Ashcroft. And so they posted it at Ashcroft, but when I looked through all the probate documents, there was no reference to the Navvy Jack House. Now, we know he owned it, but the administrator of the estate did not. So the probate was conducted only dealing with the Jack of Clubs Creek claim, the discovery placer claim. And so that was sold, and there was not much money from it. And this was an ad in the paper, with notice given by Judge Cornwall for the sale of it by November 1899. So the Navvy Jack House was never administered as part of the estate. And this was the administrator's affidavit as to what he believed the property was. Oh, by the way, there was one other property he owned, and that was up at Yukot Bay. Does anyone know where Yukot Bay is? There's a hot spring up by Bella Coola. And he went up there by rowboat, and there's a story about that. And he preempted 160 acres of the hot springs. And I noticed when I did the research, I was thinking, well, how do I know it's the same Navvy Jack, the same John Thomas? Well, the neighboring homestead was William Reese Jones, his neighbor, the person he sold the 12 acres to. Well, that's too much of a coincidence. Two adjacent homesteads up near Bella Coola at the hot springs with their neighbors. Essentially, there's two neighbors who were living here. So we know that was Navvy Jack. That wasn't dealt with as part of the estate either. And that property just probably cheated back to the Crown. So anyway, by 1905, the mortgagee sold the house to James Cooper Keith. James Cooper Keith was a local banker, well known. Keith Road's named after him. He was councillor for the municipality of North Vancouver, as it was called at the time. And he had been trying to find some way to release the property because there was nobody to buy it off. And he might have known by that time that the Navvy Jack had passed away, that the probate was complete. So it was a big mess legally. But the mortgage ended up providing him a way that he could acquire it. Because under the terms of the mortgage, if it's not paid, the mortgagee can sell it. Normally it's done by court order, but for some reason this wasn't. It was just sold on the contract and went into James Cooper Keith's name. Now, we also know that the new owner, John Lawson, had been trying to buy this property from 1905. We know that from his daughter's diary. And they had found the property, the abandoned house, in November of 1905. So the next 2 years, they had been trying to work with James Cooper Keith to buy it. And they finally became the owners in 1907. But he paid a hefty purchase price. He bought the property that had belonged to William Rhys Jones, and he bought it directly from him and from James Cooper Keith, and that's where the $10,800 price tag came from. But it was heavily mortgaged, and that's where we'll see later on, he lost the property because of that mortgage. And he brought with him his children. Gertie, known as Gertrude Lawson, like the Gertrude Lawson house, well-known school teacher, dearly loved for her whole life in West Vancouver, and which is now our archives. And her sister Bessie, who in a photo that many people have seen of a wedding, the first wedding here, it was Bessie who was married, and Duncan. Duncan was his only son. And his life ended in tragedy, as you'll see later. But first, we'll talk about the many firsts of the house. There was the first church services that took place there September 20th, 1908. As I said, he moved in Easter weekend in 1907, but they were Presbyterian, and they used to went by boat over to Granville to go to church every Sunday. But that was difficult, and then finally he was able to obtain the services, set up the services here from September 20th, 1908 at the Navvy Jack House every Sunday going on. Now the house grew, the congregation outgrew the house by 1910, not surprisingly. So they bought a tent and set it up out back. And the congregation continued there. And that house also was the location of the first school in West Van. And so they shared it. So on Sunday it was church, and during the week it was the first school, which started in, so later on, I've got it out of order, October 1911. It was also the Navvy Jack House. You'll see here the ferry, the sign of there. It was the first formal ferry service to West Vancouver. As I've said before, there was ferry service to North Van, and Navvy Jack set up the first one. But this was the first one that was a scheduled service to West Vancouver. And he obviously wanted to get people there to buy real estate, to set up the community. And so on October 8th, 1909, the first scheduled service began, landing beside his dog. And he had a small general store at the end there, and which they would sell people, and a real estate office, because he wanted to sell real estate. Now, the first post office was also set up at the Navvy Jack House. On September 1st, 1910, John Lawson became the first postmaster for West Vancouver, for the Ki-ep-i-lano district. It was known at that time as the municipality of North Vancouver. West Van didn't separate until 2 years later. But the West Ki-ep-i-lano district was where John Lawson had control of for his post office, and he also ran for council and was elected Reeve, but he was on North Vancouver Council at that time, and for the municipality representing the West Ki-ep-i-lano district. And of course, the first post office was set up in his house. The first telephone service was set up by John Lawson. He became the first agent for the BC Telephone Company in 1908. And he had a toll line that actually extended over to Lighthouse Park, and he extended it to his house. And later installed a switchboard in his office with John Lawson and his son being the first telephone operators. Just kind of... I guess there weren't that many phone calls at the time. You had to have, I think it was 50 in order to get a switchboard, 50 telephone lines, and he only had 46, and they let him go. He offered to buy the last few lines, but he said that's okay. The first schoolroom, I mentioned that already, October 1911, and first telephone service, first post office, you'll be tested after. And the first council meeting was in the tent actually had fallen down because of heavy snow. So by the time the first council meeting happened in 1912, that January, the tent collapsed, but they built another building on the same site, and that's where the first council meeting took place, in this backyard, in that building that replaced the tent, and which took over as the school, and on Sundays, the church. So this is what he set up, what he had surveyed out by 1912, and you can see it signed off on August of 1912. And there was 116 lots, which would have included his property as well. So originally it was 84 with much bigger lots by Navvy Jack's plan, but now it's extended to 116. Much more formalized. It had a right-of-way for the coming railway line, because that line would be built by 1914. Had Marine Drive and Bellevue, and the other roads were all marked on it. So he had it properly laid out to be a community. The previous plan did not. So this was what he was going to sell and make his fortune, hopefully. And over the next 2 years, he sold 62 of those 116 lots. But by 1914, there was a crash in the real estate market. The market had been a bubble before that, making people very well off. But once the war started, World War I, the Great War, properties crashed, values crashed, and he only sold a few more lots after that. But so he was basically left with holding the bag. Now, at the same time, and I'm going back to this, because he was also a farmer. And this was his display of his Harrier and Dexter cattle, prize cattle, what became the Pacific National Exhibition. The predecessor to the Pacific National Exhibition was where he displayed this in 1916. This is from 1916. So 2 years later, he may have, been pretty broke, but he still maintained his cattle and his farm. And the fruit trees that Navvy Jack planted were, I'm sure, a big hit. Much of what is now John Lawson Park were fruit trees between 17th and the house. And his cattle. Now, his developer, originally it was going to be named New Brighton, but he didn't name it that after. He named it Hollyburn. Hollyburn the Beautiful, somebody said, but it was, and the house was called Hollyburn House. And the reason he named it Hollyburn was because his favorite tree at the time were holly trees. He actually, before he moved into the house in 1907, he lived over in the West End on Pacific Boulevard, and he had holly trees there. And when he moved, he took those two holly trees and he put them beside the house by a creek. And the creek at that time, he was Scottish, and they called him Burns. So he called it Hollyburn. To put those two, that's how it got the name. Now, and 2 years later, his son, Duncan MacDonald, died. He was killed in action in the Battle of Canal Nord on September 28, 1918. John Lawson also went to war. He also enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and he went to the same year that his son did. His son went enlisted in early 1916, so he was there 2 years before he died in battle. And John Thomas was also there at the same time. He enlisted a few months later, and he went there in November of 1916, and he was there till the end. But what a tragic experience for him to lose his son. And then when he came back, he faced foreclosure. In 1919, he was facing foreclosure by John Mahon, who was the financier who lent him the money. And just have to appreciate the situation. Then for him, it was earning, he was being charged interest. The land wasn't selling. We weren't out of the Depression by 1919. A lot of land across the North Shore ended up going to the municipality by way of tax sale over those years. And in North Vancouver became rich in land because all this land that had been sold in the early years ended up going back to the municipality because people couldn't afford the taxes. It just wasn't justified. And most of the land on the North Shore was bought on speculation. And so they had to let go of it. And then for John Lawson, he lost his property. But one of the slides that I had here, I don't know if it's still there later, but it was the absolute order for foreclosure was on September 2nd, 1920. And that's when he had to leave the house. He could have been allowed to stay later, but we know that he was out of the house by 2023, some indication he was out by 2022, but he'd lost ownership by September 1920. Did I say 20s? Anyway, the owner, John Mahon, the new owner who took over, is the person who moved the house from one side of the creek to the other. And if you know the history of the house, you'll know that it was on the east side of Lawson Creek, right near where that cul-de-sac is. And I know Paul is doing the next part, is going to be showing you where. But it was moved across this creek to its current location by the British financier who took over the house and, had reset it up. He rented it out. They were rented out as you see this ad renting out in 1923, almost like a bed and breakfast or, short-term rentals. But then it was sold by John Mahon to Emma McFarlane. And she was also an absentee landlord. She never lived there. Yeah, that was in 1927. And she ended up renting it to a carpenter by the name of Leonard Hookham. And he ended up buying the house, and his family owned the house until 71. It was formally transferred in 1972. So that's my part. I'll turn it over to Paula.
The focus of this part of the talk will be on the house, the location, the original materials used to build the house, and how some of these materials have been incorporated in the restoration. I'll also be looking at the many changes to the house over time, and then provide a look to the future for the house. Navvy Jack House was built in 1873 and is located in a beautiful waterfront setting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, in what is now the district of West Vancouver. This modest wood frame building reminds us of the importance of waterfront access for early settlements for transportation, raw materials, trade, food, even providing a natural barrier. For millennia before, First Nations traveled the waters, harvested the bounty from the sea, and set up temporary camps along the water. In this panorama view, you can see the Navvy Jack House on the left in its original location, just to the west of Lawson Street, which is now 17th, which is to the right just up from the pier. You can also see in the distance the spikes of trees killed in the forest fire of 1884. This location was convenient for John Thomas, as his base of operation for his gravel business was thought to be in the secure anchorage near the Ki-ep-i-lano River in Slawiya Lagoon, which is, as Paul said, roughly in the area of the duck pond. This is a good view of the house and the barn on the left. You can see how beautifully built it is. And looking up from looking up from the pier directly up Lawson Street. You can also see in the foreground the Lawson Real Estate Company, and then just behind that, the West Van Trading Company and the Municipal Hall. It's way, way in the background. In this site plan, this shows the location of the Navvy Jack House as it is now on the west side of the creek. And in the next slide, you can see outlined with the red, that's the original location. And you can see the railway tracks behind that, and it's located just between 17th and 18th. Okay. This is one of the earliest pictures that we have of the house. This picture is from the time of John Lawson. But just imagine the house in Navvy Jack Thomas's time. There was no peak dormer at the front at the roof. There were no chimneys. The roof sloped gently towards the south, the ridgeline running parallel to the water, with the slightly curved roof over the porch and the fine detailing at the porch below. It was, as Albert Finney commented in passing by the house in May of 1874, to lay the foundations for the first Point Atchison lighthouse, his, John Thomas's, neat white house, almost elegant for its time. Incidentally, that was 8 months before James Blake had signed his interest over to John Thomas. Coupled with the information already shared that he had sold his half-interest in the Granville Hotel to build the house and barn, there's good evidence that he did indeed build the house. For more recent records, in an interview with CBC's Claire Henning in 2019, great-great-granddaughter Evelyn Lamont remembers. My grandparents used to talk about the house quite a bit when I was young. The house is kind of in disrepair now, but it was very well built. I'd really like to see it preserved as much as possible because it was built for the love of his wife. It stood the test of time. This is a good picture of the house in 1910. The house was built with the finest materials and methods of the time, including clear, old-growth fir and cedar. The house was balloon framed, a common method of framing at the time. Amazingly, some of that framing has survived at the upper level of the house. In this slide, you can see on the left the sheathing that was used for the floors. It's a full 1-inch by 12-inch fir. On top of this subfloor, they laid edge grain fir floors. And then on the right, you can see the distinctive cedar drop siding, and that's the original siding. The next slide shows the drop siding. The cedar drop siding was reused at the upper level of the house. Matching siding was added below at the main level. The fascia boards along the east side of the roof are all original and restored, and this is also true of the softened materials in this location. In this slide, you can see some of the fir beams and columns that were located in the basement. It was just incredible. They're very strong and robust. Some of the existing framing remains. However, much of the structure was reinforced and replaced to meet new standards for flood levels, which involved raising the house and providing new structure to resist flooding and to meet earthquake requirements. This is a picture of the parlor in the interior of the house at the time of John Lawson. You can see the vertical V-joint interior wood paneling. Beside that is a close-up of this salvaged material. I should also mention that in this room, the ceiling was also wood paneled. I don't have a picture of this, and I believe it's going to be reused in the new building. This shows the paneling that has been installed in the new cafe. And if you look, you can see the V-grooves. They had to plane it down quite a bit to get it up, to restore it. And I'll be very happy to get a close-up view when the cafe opens. In this photo, it's really good because you can see the original detail from John Lawson's time. You can see the lathe-turned columns with the scroll-cut brackets at the porch, sometimes referred to as Victorian gingerbread. And then if you look at that beautiful curved porch roof, these charming details really harken back to Albert Finney's comments about the house, almost elegant for its time. The builder has recreated these beautiful details in the restored house, along with the pickets in the handrails, to create a really lovely, welcoming entry. And the next slide, you can see some of the close-up views of the brackets, the columns, and the handrails. In this photo, you can see a picture of the new windows. Some of the openings survived, which was really helpful in sizing the windows. But we were all very, very happy to hear that existing wood was salvaged from the house to hand make all the new windows. And this was really quite a process involving certification to meet the most up-to-date standards and just the most meticulous craftsmanship. You can also see in this picture the salvaged cedar drop siding. You can see the soffits that were saved, and as well some of the fascia. And here you can see just a beautiful picture of the new windows. This, I think, is on the east side. This slide shows you the underside of the porch flooring, and they will be reinstalling the original porch flooring in the house. The continuing history of change the house underwent also has value and merits commemoration. The major changes took place in three main areas spanning 145 years during the time of John Lawson, the Hookhams, and the Williams families. Let's look first at the changes to the house during John Lawson's time from 1907 to 1920. We can be pretty certain of the modifications that John Lawson made to the house. In his journals published in 1932, Major Matthews, archivist and historian, describes meeting with John Lawson and accompanying him to the original location of the house. Mr. Lawson afterwards showed me a photo of the house, and he said, "It is identically the same here as it was when I first saw it, save for the addition of the two chimneys and the gable roof in front, which I added." Major Matthews continues on. The picture shows it to be about 20 feet wide, with door in center, two large windows of 4 panes on either side of the door, 4 turned and ornamented veranda posts with peculiar board and batten roofing, slightly concave to the veranda. The house is shingled, and the whole half, including the gable, faces the shore. The two chimneys, one at each end, pass through the ridge. And then in this picture, you can see the famous holly trees that were brought over by John Lawson from his house on Pacific Avenue. This next slide is one of my favorites. I love the horse. I love the fact that you can see the train tracks that had just been installed in 1914. And you can see just how close the house was to the railroad. And this is the floor plan reimagined, and evidence was found in the interior that indicate there was a central hallway about 6 feet wide, 2 rooms at the front, 2 bedrooms at the back, and there was actually some wallpaper remnants found. The second period of change was during the Hookhams' time, stretching over a period of about 44 years. The Hookhams had rented the house from Emma McFarland, and she had purchased the house, and then later they purchased it. Mr. Hookham, who operated a sash and door company in North Vancouver, got right to work on the house. It was reported in the November 30th, 1928 edition of the West Van News that J. Hookham is making repairs and improvements to his house at 18th and Waterfront. We don't know exactly what those changes were at that time, but we do have this picture of the house from 1934. And you can see that it just is completely different. It really changed the look of the house. They added this kind of double-barreled shed roof. The porches were added at the top. The lower porch was enclosed. And then the frame for that was a really very robust concrete structure, which was actually intact until very recently. The next slide shows the house in 1957, and you can see it really hasn't changed that much, though they added this front entry porch and enclosed the porch as well. Anyway, this is, oh yes. Now, the third area of change was during Bette and Lloyd Williams' residency, and that was from 1972 to 2017. Interestingly, it was not their first association with Navvy Jack in the house. In a letter to the West Vancouver Historical Society in 1986, Lloyd writes of John Thomas's son Samson, who was a good boatman, saving his uncle Albert Williams from drowning in the mouth of the Ki-ep-i-lano River. I mean, that is just such a unique link. As you can see, though, the house has changed once again, modernized in appearance with the large pane windows, the open decks, and the addition of a closed-in walkway along the east side of the house. They also added a shed roof at the back, a carport, but the core strength of the house was still intact. As Robert Williams, nephew of Lloyd, remarked, the clear timbers that support the house are so pure and solid that to drive a nail is almost impossible without drilling a hole first. The next slide is a picture of Bette and Lloyd, and you can see all the geraniums along the deck. And this was actually continuing a tradition that had started during the time of one of the tenants during the Hookham's time. And in the next slide, the Williams also beachcombed and reused materials from the house to decorate their home. Robert Williams remarked, the feature wall in the living room is made up of odd thickness planks, all saved from the house. From gatherings and hatchboards from the beach, they made cupboards and a surround for the fireplace. The house was also a meeting spot for the fit fellows who regularly met at the house with Lloyd. One can just imagine how lovely it was. It must have been with, sipping your coffee, looking out to the ocean. What could be better? This is the house. This is the house just after it was turned over back to the district. And there was a period of about 6 years between 2018 and 2024. And the house really fell into disrepute. I mean, it was really feeling its age. But thankfully, in 2024, the restoration and addition to the house by the Carrera management team commenced. And so for the next few slides, I'll just provide a brief recap of the construction and restoration of the house over the last 2 years. And I'll go as fast as I can. So here you can see the house up on stilts, and on the left, they've sheathed in and put the openings in for the new windows. And in this photo, you can see the vertical siding actually that was added during the Williams time as well, the shed roof that was on the back. And this is another picture of the house, and you can see right through. This is when it was up on stilts. It was quite a time. In this slide, you can see the house. This was for the framing of the upper levels, and they took out the whole center of the house. And remarkably, they left the gable ends, which I think that has survived. And they took off the shed roof at the back. In the next slide, you can see the framing on the roof, and you can see at the gable end the vertical siding with the drop siding underneath, and here you can see also the forming of the foundations. And then this one, just more sheathing, underlayment, and then in this one, they are preparing to add the siding, getting ready for the siding. The windows have been installed, and then here it is all wrapped up. And in this photo, you can see the installation of the siding, and in this view, all that whole top part, they had reclaimed all the siding. And this is March 2026. In April, you can see the most beautiful roof, the lovely brick chimneys, the veranda. It really, I mean, it's pretty nice, I'd say. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. I'll turn it over to Jeff and to the future and to the Navvy Jack House for another 150 years. Thank you.
We want to thank again the wisdom of the elected officials who understood what a restored Navvy Jack House could do for their community. The vision of Nevin Sanga, who couldn't be here this evening, but who made a very substantial investment in history. And I'd like to thank the strong leadership of Jill Lawler, who's here tonight as well of the district. Her guidance has proved critical in delivering a project which I believe the entire community will be very proud of. Thank you very much, everyone.